Well, how easy do you find it being a Christian in the world today, a world that doesn't support necessarily Christian values anymore? How are you getting on? How are you doing living as a Christian in a growing secular and irreligious society? A few weeks ago, Gordon read that famous illustration, which I love, can't better it really, so I'll read it again, about the young police officer taking his final exam at police college. When he comes to the question, the final question, it reads like this: "You are on patrol in London when an explosion occurs in a gas main in a nearby street. On investigation, you find a large hole has been blown in the footpath and there is an overturned van lying nearby. Inside the van, there is a strong smell of alcohol. Both occupants, a man and a woman, are injured. A passing motorist stops to offer you assistance and you realize that he is a man wanted by the police for violent armed robberies. Just at that moment, a man runs from a nearby house shouting that his wife is expecting a baby and the shock of the explosion has made the birth imminent. Another man is crying for help, having been thrown into an adjacent canal by the explosion, and he cannot swim. Bearing in mind the provisions of the Mental Health Act, describe in a few words what actions you would take." The young officer thought for a moment, picked up his pen and wrote, "Take off uniform and mingle with crowd." How are we getting on being Christians in a difficult situation with lots of pressures where the challenge to conform is always there? Don't make a stand. Don't stick up for what we really believe. Now, the Jews, in the history of the Jewish people, the Jews at the time of Esther are living in Persia. They are dispersed and exiled away from their hometown. They are now a religious minority, surrounded by a very secular culture, dominated by greed, excess, and violence. And here are the people of God with the 10 Commandments of Moses, the prophets, the purposes and plans of God, but somehow cut off from all of that, finding themselves in a foreign land where no one supports their values or wants to believe in what they come with. How do they relate to it? How do they relate to this culture that they find themselves in that no longer believes what they do? Do they try to withdraw and become a sect and be the kind of the pure, holy people over there in a corner and everybody else ignores them because they're just a bit strange and weird? That's one way. Another way would be to try to fit in, keep your own views, but keep them secret. Go into your own home and read the Bible and pray to God, but out there in the world, just sort of go along with everything. And you don't want to make a fuss. Better that you actually serve God in secret than actually make a stand. That's another way you could do it. Or you could criticize and protest everything. You could go along with the way the world does it, but you could protest at every single turn. You know, disgusted of Tunbridge Wells in Christian form. Everything you find that you disagree with, you write a letter. You're angry about everything the world is and all that's going wrong in this secular world. You could take that stance of being the kind of the moral police person for the whole thing. How do you do it? How do you live in a world where its values are so different from the values that Christians believe, that we've inherited from the Lord? This is what the story of Esther is all about. Over these next 2 weeks, we're going to look at Esther, this unlikely hero. She has been taken into exile along with many, many others. And what we're going to see just this week in this first part of the story of Esther is we're going to see these three things that I think the writer wants us to see. The first is this: God is always at work, even when it appears that he's not. Secondly, we're going to see that we should not judge by outward appearances. And thirdly, we're going to see how God frees us from being slaves to the world's ways. Firstly, God is always at work despite appearances. And the background to the story of Esther is this. King Xerxes has had this huge banquet. It lasted 180 days, and it says that at the end of it, he was drunk, which seems kind of quite reasonable, really, after 180 days of carousing. And he summons his queen, who's called Vashti. She's very beautiful, and he summons her. Now, the writer of Esther is being very, very nice. He doesn't want to kind of like provide titillation for Christians down through the ages, so he's quite circumspect in what he says. This is a drunken brawl with thousands of men who want to leer at a naked woman who is being paraded before them. That's what's going on. And Queen Vashti has been summoned, because she's Xerxes' queen, she's been summoned to parade and to delight these men, and also to show off that King Xerxes has the most beautiful queen in the whole world. The whole banquet has been about excess, showing how much power he has, his prestige, his honor, because of all the wealth he's accumulated, and to top it all, the most beautiful woman. And this was the way things went in this culture. Vashti, the queen, is not a believer, but she says, no, I'm not going. This is unheard of. This causes a social and constitutional crisis. No queen is allowed to say that. You don't speak to the king of the most powerful empire in that way. And so you've got this Vashti queen saying, I'm not going to go and do that. I'm not degrading myself in that way. The king is furious. He calls the nobles together. He says, what are we going to do about it? And he says, well, she's got to be deposed. She can't carry on being the queen. She's lucky to get away with her life. She is ejected from the court. We don't know what happens to Vashti, the woman who took a stand against King Xerxes, but she is banished. And the search goes out for a replacement. And so all Xerxes' officials go out to all the villages, towns, and the whole of Persia, and they're just spying the good-looking girls. And it's their job to choose them. And they choose thousands, and they bring them all back into the citadel, and then they have to sort of start whittling it down. Because you can't have millions, you've got to have just a few in the harem. And so they're whittled down to the most beautiful ones, and Esther, who has been taken, she's an orphan, has been taken with her uncle into the citadel. Esther gets through the first round, she gets through the second round. Then she's invited, along with the chosen few, to go through all the beauty treatments. She goes on a special diet to make her beautiful and to enhance her beauty. And then finally, it turns out that she is the most beautiful of all of them, and she's presented to King Xerxes, who says, you're just the best. But you know what he's thinking. He's just thinking you're the best because you're the most pretty, you're the most beautiful, you look the best. And so he takes her to be his queen. And he throws a huge big banquet, probably like the previous one, for Queen Esther, this orphan girl who becomes the queen of the greatest empire of its time. But this book of Esther is written to tell us some things. The first thing it tells us is this, and it's very interesting. I don't know if you've noticed. The book of Esther, there is no mention of God. Did you know that? If you read through the book of Esther, there is no mention of God in it. It's the only book of the Bible that has no reference to God at all. In fact, if you only had the book of Esther in the whole Bible, you wouldn't even know that there was a God. No reference to prophecy, no reference to prayer, no reference to the commandments of God. You would not know there was a God at all. In fact, even at places where the author could or naturally should mention God, it's almost as if they avoid mentioning it. Now, what's going on? This can't just be an oversight. I mean, the writer doesn't get to the end of the book and just think, oh my gosh, I left God out. How did that happen? This is deliberate. I mean, this is it's a literary device. What's the author trying to show us? The Jews are in great danger. There's going to be a genocide against the Jewish race within captivity. This could be the end of God's purposes for his people. If Israel falls at this point, no Jesus, no line of David to continue, no Christianity, no church, no us. And it hangs in the balance here, as we'll see later on next week. Whenever God sees his people in trouble, he acts. Book of Exodus, God sets his people free, mighty acts, the judgments of plagues that come upon Pharaoh. Everybody knows this is the hand of God. Even Pharaoh acknowledges it's the finger of God. In Elijah, when challenged by the Baals, the prophets, there's this incredible miracle, isn't there? And fire falls from heaven and consumes the sacrifice. Whenever God's people are in serious danger, God comes to act. They're in serious danger now, and nothing. No raised up prophet. No dream in the night, no word from on high, no miraculous appearance, no cavalry coming in sight. What you see here in the book of Esther is that God seems to be silent at the very time that they need him more than ever. But what we see as we read the book of Esther is a whole string of coincidences. Some scholars say they identify 15 coincidences that if any one of them hadn't happened, I mean, think of it like this. If King Xerxes hadn't got drunk, Vashti would still be queen. But Esther has to become the queen if the story is going to work, if God's people are going to be saved. So Vashti is called to the banquet because Xerxes is drunk. Now, when God pulls down plagues upon Pharaoh, you think that's the finger of God. But when Xerxes gets drunk, you don't think, well, that's the finger of God, do you? You just think, silly man. But actually, what we're seeing in Esther is, no, this was God working when you don't think he's working. This is God at work in your life when you think he's absent, when you think he's not hearing you or doing anything at all. Esther has to be the queen. If Esther has to be pretty, what if Esther hadn't been born pretty? She wouldn't have been chosen. Later on, we find that the king forgets to honor Mordecai because he found out about the plot to murder the king. But if he had been honored straight away after it happened, Esther would never have got to the position that she got into to be able to influence the king, as we'll see next week. And again, God's people would not have been delivered. Time after time in this story, in these circumstantial events, the writer wants us to see the hand of God at work. What's the point? The point is God is at work in your life and mine, even when you feel he isn't. And that invites trust and invites us to put our confidence in God, even when we don't see an answer to our prayer, even when we wonder why certain events and things happen. It doesn't mean everything that happens is God's will. But this is the Old Testament version of Romans 8:28 in the New Testament. God is working all things together for good, taking both the good and the bad that happens, and he is weaving it into something beautiful, though you may not see it at the time and wonder why God hasn't delivered you. God's silence is not absent. His absence, his hiddenness is not abandonment. In the silence, God is working, and you and I are invited to trust him even when we can't see it. Even when it seems like our prayers are falling on a heaven made of brass. The book of Esther says, no, God is working and conspiring events to happen. We're invited to trust him. Arthur Ainger was an Eton schoolmaster at the end of the 19th century. He was good friends with the Archbishop at the time, Archbishop Benson. Don't think there's any family connection. But Archbishop Benson was a good friend of Arthur Ainger. And the Archbishop becomes ill and he dies. And Arthur Ainger is very upset that his friend has died. And himself a scholar as well as a schoolmaster and a writer of hymns prays. And he tries to understand why has God allowed his friend, the Archbishop, to die prematurely and in this way. And we don't exactly know how he reasoned it, but we do know that a year later, in memory of Archbishop Benson, he writes the hymn, God is working his purpose out as year succeeds to year. You may not see it or understand why things happen the way they do, but God is working his purpose out. He has to, or he isn't God. And that invites you and I to trust him for the things we can't see, for the events in our lives where we think, well, why isn't God at work? Why no miracle? Why no cavalry coming in sight? Because he's still at work. We have to trust. That's the first thing the book of Esther shows us. God is at work even when it looks as if he isn't. The second thing it does is it reminds us of a great truth. We know this, but it reminds us again. Don't judge by outward appearances. The whole of this empire is based on outward appearances. It's all about the king showing his great wealth and showing how powerful he is because he has all this incredible banquet to be able to give. He can afford to take half a year off work to celebrate, which I could. You know, it's like that's what he does. And then it's to parade his wealth. And then not content with parading all his gold and possessions before everybody, he then wants to present his wife. before everybody, to show how beautiful she is and to make them envious that he, the king, has more than anyone else could possibly imagine. And Esther is the most beautiful person that we've ever seen. This whole first 2 chapters is all about things on the outside that appear to be desirable, that appear to be the things that we should want the most. His queen must be the most beautiful one of all. He must establish his power and position. He calls this beauty parade together. These are the most important things: status based on your accomplishments, your outward beauty, the prestige that you could get. Aren't you glad we don't live back in those days? Doesn't change, does it? See, the world doesn't change. This is just a beautiful example of how the world does things. And the world wants you to conform to its standard. Be beautiful on the outside. Acquire the things that you need to give you a sense of purpose and identity. Get the prestige and the respect that you deserve. And the world teaches you to go after those things, because if you don't have something to offer, either beauty or money or prestige or something, then you're nothing. You need to perform and go through the world's beauty treatments in order to get the prestige and the value that you need. And the world tries to conform you and I into it because it's how the world does it. It's how apparently the world has always done it. And that's the biggest stand that we and Esther are invited to stand against, if you like. And if you look at the first 2 chapters of the story, you ask, how's Esther doing? How's she doing in taking a godly stand against the world? And this may shock you, but most of the scholars and the commentators and the people that write about the story of Esther, they say this: she's doing really badly. I mean, she gets to her position by total compromise. I mean, she caves in at every opportunity. She allows herself to be chosen. She puts herself forward. She allows her, and again, the writer, as I've said, is being very circumspect, doesn't want to stir anything up. But when Esther is presented before the people in this great banquet, I mean, you've got to understand how she's being presented. She's being presented as a sex idol. That's what's happening. And Esther's going along with this. She's actually doing everything that the world is trying to say that she should do. She doesn't stick to the strict dietary laws as Daniel did. She doesn't speak the uncomfortable truth like Jeremiah did. She just goes along with it. And at this point in time, Esther doesn't seem to have the courage or the know-how to stand against the culture. The hero in a modern society today, where many feminist writers would see in the story of Esther that actually Queen Vashti is the hero here. I mean, she says no and takes the consequences. Queen Esther, she goes along with it. This is what's going to make her an unlikely hero. So what's the point of this? The thing is, we're the same, aren't we? Well, let's just put it like this. I'm the same. Many of us are doing exactly the same thing as Esther. We're selling our souls for one night with the king, hoping it will give me what I'm looking for, make me complete, help me to find myself. We work crazy hours thinking that if I have financial security, it's more important than anything else. I say, I want revival. We want revival in our churches and in our land. We want to see revival. But how badly do I really want to see revival? I was reading a book just a few weeks ago on the Hebridean revival, and it was talking about how they would have all-night prayer meetings. And the author helpfully explains why they had all-night prayer meetings. I mean, why not just pray all day? Why do you have to pray all night? He just says they wanted revival more than a night's sleep. Jesus said the same to his disciples. He says, could you not watch him 1 hour? I mean, how serious are you about this? How serious am I about this? I want revival, but I want a good night's sleep, because the world says you need a good night's sleep. See, we say that we want those things, but all of us, to an extent, have compromised with the world in some ways. And maybe in the past we've compromised with the world. We've made choices and done things that have gone the world's way rather than taking a stand. We've all sold out in different ways to the world's culture while believing the Christian message. We're not really that different from Esther, many of us. Most of us, all of us. She gets off to a terrible start. But what's really neat is what she's going to become. Next week, you'll see what she becomes. What's the message for us? My friends, the message for us is this. You may in the past have compromised to the world's standards in the areas of sex, beauty, perhaps in the areas of choices about money, about jobs. But God never writes you out of his story. There is no plan B, just a rerouted plan A. And if we're sitting here today thinking, I have compromised to the world, I've made decisions and choices that were the world's choice for me, not what I think God wanted me to do. I didn't stand up for that thing. That's okay. God has a plan for Esther. He has a plan for you. God takes people who have compromised with the world. And as we'll see next week in the story of Esther, it doesn't write you out. He doesn't say, well, you've blown it. He just says, we'll start from here. Just like a sat-nav does in the car. You know, if you overshoot the junction, it doesn't sort of say, you idiot. The old sat-nav used to, but the new one doesn't say that. The new one just says recalculating and finds a new route back. I think God is like a sat-nav. If you take the wrong turn, if we compromise, well, he just says, okay, this is what I wouldn't have chosen to start from here, but here's where we are, so let's find a way back. Friends, what this means is that God hasn't given up on you. It's time to release your regrets about the past, thinking that that can stop you from fulfilling the plan and purpose of God today. You've got to let them go. God uses the most unlikely people. Esther's story, I love the way the Bible doesn't gloss over the truth. It shows us the most unlikely hero, orphan girl with probably very little confidence. She's just very pretty. Finds herself in this role, overwhelmed with what's happened in her life, probably taken in by it, just like us. But God has chosen her, and she is going to come through, and so will you, so will I. That's the great thing about the story of Esther. Do not harden your heart and think there's no hope. I might as well just carry on the way I have been because I've already blown it. No, you may have already blown it, but God has chosen you and he doesn't change his mind. That's the second point. But we do have to do something. And that's the third thing I want to just share briefly. God wants to free you from enslavement to the world's way. And Esther will make a stand. Next week we'll see she does have to make a stand. She has to take a stand for what is right and for God's plan and purpose. And ironically, God will use her beauty and her status, but she's going to have to do something. Xerxes will remember her as the most beautiful. The court will remember her as the queen and her position. But God's people will ever remember her for her God-found courage, which saves God's people from genocide. Next week, we'll see that Esther has to be willing to put her beauty, her wealth, and her status, and everything she's acquired, she has to put it all on the line for such a time as this. Even the things that were God's gift to her, her beauty, none of this was of her own doing. You can't make your own beauty. Esther, these were given. God had given them to her, but she had to be willing to lay them all down to do the right thing. And there will come a point in your life and mine where whatever we've accomplished and accumulated in life, there may come a time when we have to lay it all down in order to do the will of God. And in that moment, providing we can make a stand, the past is redeemed. Because God uses Esther's compromise with the world. Ultimately, he uses it in order to bring salvation for God's people. He redeems that compromise and uses her position to bring about a change of heart for the king. And the second thing this story of Esther does, it points us to Jesus. Jesus said all these scriptures point to me. Jesus is the true and better bridegroom who loves you already in order to make you beautiful, not because you already are beautiful. Jesus is the great bridegroom. He's the true bridegroom. He doesn't choose you because you're outwardly beautiful, but because he knows what you can become when you go through his beauty treatments. When you go through the formation of the Christian life, and an inner beauty is formed in you, reflected in courage, reflected in quiet trust. This is the way that the women of old made themselves beautiful. This is the way the men make themselves courageous. By allowing God to form and shape them to go through his beauty treatments so that we become acceptable and the delight of the King. Except that Jesus has already done it for you, because he already treats you as you will become. He calls those things that aren't as if they are, and in doing so calls them into the reality of what he says. God says, let there be light, and there is light. He calls it into being, and he speaks over your life and my life about how precious you are, how valuable and important you are to him, and he speaks it over your life. And as you hear it, he calls you to step into it. You aren't it yet, but he sees you as if you are. And in doing that, he draws you into that reality of how he sees you. Only God can give you the real definition of beauty. Xerxes has decided what makes people beautiful, but God is the one who says, listen, it's not what you look like on the outside. Don't be bluffed by appearances. He says, you are who I say you are. I get to define who you are. Not your outward qualities. God gets to define who you are. And we need to learn to speak to others as God sees them. In our churches, in our life groups, in our meetings together. This is a reparenting factory where we learn to speak over each other how God is seeing us. We treat each other with the dignity that maybe we never had. We speak to each other with love and compassion, maybe that the person never had. And in doing so, we reflect how God sees them, and bit by bit, we begin to trust who God says you are. And finally, find a Mordecai. Mordecai is the hidden character in this story. Mordecai has a watchful eye over Esther, and he's integral to this whole story. Sounds a bit kind of an old-fashioned way of saying it, but I just put down here, who's your Mordecai? Esther actually comes good in the end because Mordecai holds her to account and says, perhaps your beauty, perhaps your wealth, perhaps all this compromise with the current world status, perhaps all of that is for this moment now. And if you make the right choice now, Esther, you can save God's people. But it's Mordecai that holds her to that. She couldn't do it on her own. She needs someone walking alongside her. Hidden in the shadows is this wonderful uncle, Mordecai. Every one of us, my friends, needs someone to walk with us. Every one of us needs someone like Mordecai. Do you have one? Someone you can trust and open yourself up to. Somebody who can speak into your life, to draw you away from the world's way and to help you to hear God's plan. We need other people to help. We can't do it on our own. Esther couldn't. You need a Mordecai. And if you don't have one, pray. Talk to someone about whether you could meet up with them in a prayer triplet, that you could share and open up the struggles that you're having in compromising possibly with the world. And let them draw you into the purposes of God as Mordecai does for Esther. Heavenly Father, thank you for this beautiful ancient story that shows us so much of our own lives and of ourselves and of our culture today. And I pray, Father, that as we meet at Christ Church on Sundays in small groups, that we will get better at hearing your voice in our hearts, speaking to us about who we are, so that our identities are not rooted in our wealth or our beauty or all the things we've chased after, but they're rooted in who you say we are. Our identity is found in what you say about us. That becomes the solid rock on which the decisions of our life are based. Father, we pray that that might be so for our lives. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.